Matthew Dawn reporting there. The European Union has announced plans to overhaul its digital sector, aiming to reduce reliance on Chinese and US firms. Plans include tripling Europe's data centre capacity and encouraging tech firms from outside the EU to provide services. Deutsche Welle correspondent Arthur Sullivan joins us now from Berlin. Arthur, g'day. So what exactly is this package and what are the main areas of focus?
So the EU has called this plan the European Technological Sovereignty Package, which sounds a little bit jargony, but basically what it is a set of measures which it hopes will make it safer and more secure when it comes to some of those critical sectors powered by high-tech services in areas, for example, such as artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and so on, semiconductors as well. And the EU increasingly wants these key sectors to be made in Europe, or certainly to an extent controlled by Europe. So this plan is focused on a few specific things. One of them is a new Chips Act, so that's obviously aimed at boosting semiconductor production. Another is a Cloud and AI Development Act aimed at developing Europe's AI capacity. Obviously that's focused on data centres. And then thirdly, the EU also wants to develop a more wide-ranging open source strategy. The idea there would be that more European firms would work together to develop tech for some of these critical domains. And then it also says that it wants to digitalise Europe's energy system. So in its own words, ensuring that data centres are integrated into the European energy system. So those are the key areas that it focused on in its announcement yesterday. But so far it is just plans.
Yeah, so it's essentially all about independence and sovereignty. How effective is it likely to be?
Yeah, well, I mean, the EU is highly dependent on the US and China and others for a lot of these high-tech requirements in these things like digital services, infrastructure and intellectual property. And that's before we even get into something like semiconductors, where it gets between 80 and 90% of those from outside the EU and is completely dependent on the US and Asia for the most advanced chips. So how effective would a plan be when you're that dependent? I mean, the issue here is really that how much money can the EU spend on this to develop the kind of firms that would be capable of rivaling companies such as Microsoft, Amazon and Google, and then indeed developing the kind of manufacturers which would be capable of developing semiconductors to the extent to which the world's leading countries in that sector are doing so. Realistically, you would require a huge amount of money to do that, and so far critics of this plan say there's nowhere near enough money has been committed from the EU to create those kind of champions, those kind of companies. So that's one of the major criticisms so far. The other thing that we have to remember here is so far these are just proposals. They will still have to be agreed upon by the 27 member states. They will have to go through a complex process of negotiation from member states in this regard. And for many of these EU plans, that's often tricky enough. But this one, it could be particularly tricky because we've already heard murmurs of opposition from national governments, from members of the European Parliament about this. So there may be a bit of horse trading, there may be some watering down. And then the other issue here is that in devising these plans, I mean, it's one thing for the EU to sort of say, well, we need to de-risk from China. There's a lot of agreement around that. But de-risking from the US is a different issue. I mean, there is obviously increasing hostility from the Trump administration towards Europe, but the EU is trying to not annoy or upset the US government or companies with this plan. And so far, the signs are that that has not been successful. We've already heard significant opposition from those companies I mentioned, like Microsoft, Amazon and Google, in terms of this plan. They've talked about things like protectionism, and certainly some lobby groups on their behalf say this is protectionism from the EU. So in terms of the initial response to it, it doesn't look like it's going to be that effective so far, but ultimately we're going to find out in the years ahead how effective this will be, because so many of these proposals have this great overarching idea behind them, but the EU is good at coming up with these kind of proposals, these big overarching industrial strategies. How good are they at actually implementing them? In terms of high-tech innovation, the record has been patchy at best. So it really, we really would have a lot of convincing, they have a lot of convincing to do to show that this plan will actually be effective in the long run.
Okay, Arthur Sullivan there in Berlin. A Sherpa guide who was missing on Mount Everest for almost a week has been found alive. The Nepalese man was without an oxygen tank or food and was spotted crawling